So far in this series of lectures on consciousness, I've dealt with some of the difficulties associated with explaining mental events on the basis of physical evidence. In this lecture, I want to examine two alternative perspectives, referred to respectively as the identity thesis and supervenience. At first blush, both are likely to seem quite strange as theories, especially the first. I'll begin with that one, the identity theory. It has been advanced in various forms by a number of different philosophers, and as I will attempt to show, it does face hardships unique to itself, not the least of which is its counterintuitive character. Its particular strength lies in the fact that it doesn't set out to explain causal relationships between mental and physical events. Indeed, it doesn't deal with causality at all, for it doesn't accept the proposition that there are, in fact, bona fide and uniquely mental events. Although there are various forms of the identity thesis, they all have this in common. They all proceed from the same ontological position, according to which there is only one kind of entity in reality, and that is a physical entity. We can say then that all versions of the identity thesis adopt monistic materialism. From time to time, it is useful to qualify this very expression by referring instead to monistic physicalism. This is really little more than a refinement based on the fact that not everything physical has mass as such. There are physical entities, such as charge, which are not material. So as I say, the more precise designation is that of monistic physicalism, which asserts that whatever has real existence is, finally, physical. I note, however, that physicalism and materialism are generally regarded as interchangeable, and I might use them in just that way. Now, what about thoughts and hopes and desires and feelings? Are we to assume that these are non-existent? For most of us, it would be far easier to assume that there's no physical reality than to assume that there are no thoughts, hopes, desires, feelings, etc. How could we even agree to accept the identity thesis itself, except on the assumption that we are capable of, what? Knowledge and belief. Well, the defense of the identity thesis begins not with a denial of knowledge or belief, but with an example of how such terms are to be understood. Let's take as an example that of lightning. Most of us have had the experience of bright flashes across the sky, accompanied by thunder. Look, we say, it is lightning. Now, our remote ancestors also saw the sky light up this way. In all ages that provide a record of meteorological events, there is evidence of lightning. But what is lightning? Well, as it happens, the phenomenon we call lightning is an electrical discharge. This was true long before we had a theory of electricity. It was true long before anyone knew about electrical discharges. If we were to say, even to the most intelligent of the ancient Greek scientists, what you are calling lightning in your language is actually an electrical discharge, presumably he would have no idea of what we were talking about. Of course, we do get the English word electricity from the ancient Greek root electron, but this is obviously beside the point. Now, let's take another example. Over the ages, people have become quite familiar with identical twins. The world's languages have phrases that identify such twins as being identical. The basis upon which the judgment is made is the striking similarity in appearance and the simultaneous time of birth for the two twins. However, in a surprisingly large number of instances in the past, fraternal twins have often been incorrectly identified as identical. Modern technology makes this misidentification more or less impossible now because we can actually compare the DNA samples from the two twins. Let's ignore this and simply recognize that what we mean by the term identical twins has meant the same thing over the long eons of human life and long before anyone knew anything about DNA. There surely were times when the accepted explanation for the appearance of identical twins was based on theories about the gods. Presumably, the goddess presiding over births had the power to create identical twins. Now, a people holding this belief surely had words for the presumed divine power that results in identical twins. We can make up a word. We can call it twos-alike. Twos-alike, we see, turns out to be very much like lightning. Just as we accept that there is lightning, we accept that there are identical twins. What the identity theorist wants to make clear, however, is that in these instances, there is not both twos-alike and DNA. Rather, the fundamental answer to the question, by what means were identical twins brought about, is identical DNA. Now, similarly, there is not something properly called lightning in addition to there being electrical discharges. Rather, if the word lightning refers to anything, it refers to electrical discharges. What we have here are examples of what philosophers call an identity of reference, which is distinguishable from an identity of meaning. When we refer to the morning star and the evening star, we often mean different things. Among other considerations, one of these words refers to the time of observation, the time of day when persons would call Venus the morning star is quite different from the time during which we use the name evening star. Now, if someone were to take up lodgings in the house of an astronomer and were to ask, "What time is breakfast served?" only to be told, "As soon as you can see the morning star," the guest would surely know that breakfast will be served well before noon. But note that there are not two stars, even though for centuries, even the most scientifically advanced people did not know that morning star and evening star, phosphorus and Hesperus, were two terms referring to what? A single object. Thus, the terms morning star and evening star exemplify an identity of reference, though the terms do mean different things in different contexts. Now, what about lightning? If I were to say that on cloudy days featuring loud thunder, it is very likely that there will be electrical discharges taking place in the sky, I might be saying something that is somewhat different in meaning from, on a day like today, there's likely to be lightning. Clearly, however, what is referred to in those two sentences is the same phenomenon. It's not that the electrical discharges cause lightning, it's just that in such instances, electrical discharges are the lightning. Now, with this much clear, we can illustrate the identity thesis this way. When Eleanor says she has a toothache, she is referring not to a mental state, but to a brain state. A proper understanding of the toothache is not that it is causally brought about by an event in the brain, but that it just is an event or process in the brain. One very influential argument to this effect was advanced by the Australian philosopher J.J.C. Smart in an article titled Sensations and Brain Processes. The article is nearly 50 years old, but it retains its freshness and expresses a position as current within philosophy of mind as anything said more recently. Now, I want you to listen to these lines from Professor Smart's early essay of about a half-century ago. Quote, There does seem to be, so far as science is concerned, nothing in the world but increasingly complex arrangements of physical constituents, all except for one place, in consciousness. That is, for a full description of what is going on in a man, you would have to mention not only the physical processes in his tissues, glands, nervous system, and so forth, but also his states of consciousness, his visual, auditory, and tactual sensations, his aches and pains. That these should be correlated with brain processes does not help, for to say they are correlated is to say that they are something over and above. You cannot correlate something with itself. You correlate footprints with burglars, but not Bill Sikes the burglar with Bill Sikes the burglar. So sensations, states of consciousness, do seem to be the one sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. And for various reasons, I just cannot believe that this can be so. That everything should be explicable in terms of physics, except the occurrence of sensations, seems to me to be, frankly, unbelievable." Close quote. Well, Smart's thinking here was an extension of earlier arguments along the same lines by a professor UT Plus and also by Herbert Feigl, both moved by the same commitment to ontological economy, similar to Smart's commitment. What Smart rejects, because he regards it as, to use his word, unbelievable, is an ontology that requires two radically different forms of reality, one physical and the other, who knows what. Well, there is no doubt but that the identity theory is parsimonious. It reduces reality from a two-substance to a single-substance affair and puts no strain on the credulity of the physicalist. Pleased to have this parsimony, we then face, nonetheless, two insistent questions. Yes, but is it true? And in any case, at what price do we gain this parsimony? After all, the desire for parsimony is surely worth a good bit, but not the family fortune. It may sound exotic by contemporary standards, but philosophy really is something of a search for truth, and to the extent that it is, we have to know more about a theory than the economies it might produce. We also want to know if it is sound. And to make this determination, we have to be sure that we're clear on just what it is that the theory asserts. In its usual form, the identity theory declares that mental states and processes, properly understood, are actually states and processes taking place in the brain. On this account, there is actually only one set of states and processes, namely neurophysiological states and processes. There are not mental states as such, enjoying some reality of their own, apart from the physical reality that includes everything else. Thus, if we persist in our use of mentalistic terms, it can only be for reasons of habit, or convenience, or for that matter, sheer ignorance. The more informed we become, so the argument goes, and the more willing we are to abandon old habits, the more the language of the physical sciences will replace such mentalistic terms. Even if we choose to retain the mentalistic language, we will do so with the certain knowledge that it refers to physical processes and events. We see then that the identity theory establishes the mental as the physical, that there is not a relationship between two distinct entities, but only one entity, for which we seem to have two modes of expression. We might summarize the theory by calling any and every so-called mental event M, and any and every physical event P. the identity theory can now be compressed as M is P. If, in fact, our words for sensations, thoughts, feelings, and so forth actually refer to anything, then what they refer to is something physical, namely some physical event or process in the brain. Well, to ask if a theory of this sort is true, or at least logically coherent, requires us to consider the nature of identity relations in general. Where such identities are alleged, there is a traditional test of sorts that must be passed, a test advanced by the philosopher Gottfried von Leibniz. It's often referred to as Leibniz's criterion of identity, Leibniz's criterion of the identity of indiscernibles, as the phrase has it. A somewhat technical way of expressing the test is this. A and B are identical, just in case everything that can be truthfully said of A can be substituted as a statement about B without there being any alteration in truth value of the statement. Implicit in this is that the things we say about A and B are relevant in the metaphysical sense. Mental states and brain states differ, of course, in the sense that the word mental has 6 letters, whereas brain has only 5 letters. Obviously, this difference is not at all metaphysically relevant to the issue. Instead, the test of the identity of the mental and the physical would be in this form. Whatever might be truthfully said about a given mental state can be substituted by a statement about a specific brain state without there being an alteration in the truth value of that statement. Well, perhaps it's time to apply the test. Let's choose as a mental state Samantha's nasty toothache. We note that Samantha is in pain. Now, as noted, a fair amount is known about the neurophysiological correlates of pain. We know about the unmyelinated C fibers whose activity leads to further events taking place in specific regions of the brain. Defenders of the identity thesis would want to say in this circumstance that we do not have 2 ontologically distinct events to explain, one being Samantha's pain and the other being events taking place in Samantha's brain. There is, in fact, just one reality here, Samantha's brain process. Samantha's pain just is this brain process. Now, if this is so, then by Leibniz's test, there should be nothing truthfully and relevantly said about Samantha's pain that could not be substituted as a statement about Samantha's brain processes. Some have argued, however, that there actually is something that might be truthfully said about Samantha's pain that could never possibly be truthfully applied to statements about Samantha's brain, or for that matter, about any physical event or process. When Samantha says that she has a toothache, assuming here that Samantha is not attempting to deceive us, well, what Samantha says goes. Reports that she gives about her pains are said to be incorrigible. There isn't some device external to and independent of Samantha that she must consult in order to learn if she's correct in declaring that she has a pain. We say that she enjoys a certain epistemic authority or epistemic privilege when it comes to her own pains, or at least statements about her own pains. It would be quite peculiar for her to say something like, "If I'm not mistaken, I'm in intense pain." But of course it would never be peculiar for Samantha to say something like, "Unless I'm mistaken, I am in brain state X." Samantha can't be mistaken about being in intense pain, but she surely can be mistaken about anything she might say about her own brain states, or anyone else's brain states, or any physical event or state at all. We see then that there seems to be a class of statements about one's own sensations, that cannot be substituted as statements about physical things without there being some fundamental alteration in the truth value of the statement itself. We might say in this case that Leibniz's law of the identity of indiscernibles has been violated. I note here, but only in passing, that if there is an exception to Leibniz's law, it might be found in the field of quantum physics, but such exceptions would not seem to vindicate the identity theory as applied to physicalism. All sorts of odd possibilities arise within the context of quantum physics, and some of these will be reserved to a later lecture in this series. I should say there are other objections to the identity thesis to which philosophers have given greater or lesser weight. We take the proposition that a thing is itself as necessarily true. Ontologically, that the morning star is the evening star is a necessary truth, in just the sense that one thing cannot be two things. However, mental states and physical states, I say however the two are to be understood, it surely isn't the case that if they are identical, they are so necessarily. That a thing is itself is true in all possible worlds. But we certainly can imagine a world in which there are mental events without there being any physical events, as well as a world in which mental events are causally brought about by physical events, or a world in which mental events and physical events simply occur in parallel. Obviously, the identity thesis cannot plausibly maintain that mental events just are physical events and are so necessarily. Well, to get around this difficulty, defenders of the thesis have argued that the identity in question is not one of necessity, but one of contingency. On this account, it would go like this: of all the things that mental events conceivably might have been, it's just contingently the case that they turn out to be physical events. That is to say, of all the names the baby might have been given, it's just the case that the name Samantha was chosen. That the specific person we've referred to as having a toothache is Samantha is said on this account simply to exemplify a contingent identity. Well, there is much to be said for and against this particular gambit. My own metaphysical biases being what they are, I must admit to considerable skepticism regarding the very notion of a contingent identity. Of course, there are many statements in which two terms have a different sense but refer to the same thing: witness, morning star, and evening star. As it required some deep thought and careful observation to discover that these two designations both refer to the planet Venus, we see that the identity amounts to an empirical discovery. The identity thus discovered was not that which obtains between what are essentially synonyms of the sort bachelors are unmarried men. Nonetheless, that Venus is itself, and necessarily is itself, no matter how many distinct names are assigned to it, is not a contingent fact, but a necessary truth. We accept that, of all the names the baby might have been given, Samantha was the, let's say, merely contingent choice. In that case, we can agree that the woman with the toothache just is contingently named Samantha. But we surely do not agree that of all the women Samantha might have been, she is just contingently herself. There is much more here, some of it a bit thorny, that really should be consulted. Renewed interest in the very logic of identities was ushered in by Saul Kripke in a very famous book titled Naming and Necessity, which was published in 1980. Kripke distinguished between what he termed rigid designators and proper names. Consider the proper name Napoleon. On the two sides of an alleged identity relation, we place Napoleon and lost the decisive Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Now, clearly, of all the military officers who might have lost that battle, we can say it's not logically necessary that Napoleon happened to be that officer. There are other conceivable worlds in which France wins the War of 1812, or where Napoleon never enters military service. Well, without belaboring the point, what Kripke argued is that objects picked out by proper names are never necessarily identical to any set of properties or conditions. Rigid designators, on the other hand, are what they are in all possible worlds. Napoleon remains himself if he exists at all, and an entity is itself necessarily. Now, what has this to do with the identity thesis? Well, let's return to Samantha's pain. It is quite clear that there may well be a possible world in which discharge patterns from unmyelinated C fibers result in the sensation of sweetness. In point of fact, it is surely plausible to think that any number of animal species endure something akin to pain, including species that do not have C fibers. However, it is not plausible to think that in some other possible world, pain is not pain. So here again, we do not have an identity of indiscernibles, as Leibniz might have put it. We have a particular mental state that remains what it is in all possible worlds, whereas the brain states that would serve as candidate substitutes are not necessarily what they are in all possible worlds. One or another form of identity theory is alive and well within philosophy of mind, and I surely would not suggest for a moment that the criticisms against it have been fatal. A faithful tool in all of philosophy is the educated hunch. And my own educated hunch is that every version of the identity theory will finally be jettisoned, and for several reasons, not all of them logically compelling. Suppose it is the case that there is nothing in the domain we are pleased to call the mental that is anything but a collection, no matter how complex or elusive, of physical events and processes taking place somewhere within the cranium, and let's say the balance of the body. The emphasis is here on nothing. In other words, everything that is thinkable, everything that is felt or desired, everything that is known, all this and more finally turns out to be no more than expressions of our physicality. Fine. In that case, nothing whatever changes. Thought and desire and feeling, social interactions, civic life, all of the problems and possibilities of life as it is actually lived remain exactly what they are, for by the very terms of the alleged identity, they must be so. It would seem that one conclusion to be drawn from the theory is that if it's true, it's not really at all consequential. One has every right to expect of a revolutionary theory that it will change things. But all this theory does is burden us with a language which we are not used to using, as if we would thereby understand more completely things that are fairly well understood with the language we have long used. Well, to say no more, that's not an especially appealing theory. Is there another gambit, one that saves the language but spares us the housekeeping duties created by a two-substance ontology? Might supervenience do the trick? Now, as commonly employed in philosophy of mind, the term supervenience owes its currency to Donald Davidson's seminal essay, Mental Events. Davidson summarized the thesis this way: mental characteristics are in some sense dependent or supervenient on physical characteristics. Such supervenience might be taken to mean that there cannot be two events exactly alike in all physical respects, but differing in some mental respects, or that an object cannot alter in some mental respects without altering in some physical respects." Close quote. It is an uncommon word, but one that expresses any number of ordinary facts. That structure we call a house supervenes on bricks and the mortar used to build it. In its usual form, the theory of supervenience does not begin by denying mental states. Rather, defenders of the theory are willing to retain the ordinary language used to refer to various states, all the properties associated with psychological life. They're also willing to retain the ordinary language used to refer to various common items, such as houses and tables. Consider the dining room table. We say it's a long rectangular table made of maple. No doubt but the dining room contains a table. However, every property that qualifies it as a table we now see supervenes on something more fundamental, in this case on maple wood. Of course, the wood supervenes on something more fundamental, molecules, and the molecules on atoms, and the atoms on subatomic particles, etc. If we accept all this, we understand that there are not two ontologically distinct realms, one with dining room tables and another with subatomic particles. Rather, we accept that the table as given in experience is constituted of materials, some of them invisible, but absent these there would be no table. Taking our more prosaic example of a table, we might say that a table cannot change in its shape or density or color without there being an alteration in the physical properties on which these visible and palpable properties supervene. Well, now let's get back to the issue of mental states. We see that what the supervenience thesis requires is this: two persons can't be different in the pains they feel without the underlying neurophysiological processes being different. A person can't move from one mental state to another without moving from one physical state to another. There's much to recommend in this theory, but it seems to me the problem with it is that in every application where it seems sound, the properties in question just don't match up with anything that makes the mind-body problem a problem. It's obviously the case that a wooden table is not only made of wood, but that wood is a composite of elemental physical materials. But I don't know that anyone ever seriously contended that a table was anything else. Well, what about mental events and thoughts? What about qualia, the very nature of the experience itself? Can this be explained on the basis of supervenience? We shall see.